We're joined by David Arkless, President of Manpower's Corporate and Government Affairs section. You've been talking here at the INSEAD Leadership Summit in the Middle East about human capital. What are the main challenges facing the Middle East, this region, the Gulf region, in terms of its human capital?
There are huge challenges, and the issue of economic growth tied to the requirement to provide talent is just the biggest issue for the Arab world and specifically for the Gulf states. We've been talking today, and I thought today was a great conference. It brought up most of the major issues. As whenever you get an INSEAD event, it always says, bring up the serious stuff, and the serious stuff came up today. But if you look at the interesting dynamics of the workforce in this region, you will find that there is, on the one hand, some fairly positive news compared to the rest of the developing world and the developed world. In other words, the fertility rates are great. So with a fertility rate across the Arab world of 2.9, it means the population's expanding. One of the problems, though, is that all of the young people being born are not automatically or necessarily going into the workforce. So we have an average unemployment rate of young people in the Arab world of over 30%. Now that is a serious problem. If you come to somewhere like the United Arab Emirates, it's not as much of a problem, less than 7%. If you go to Egypt, it's 47%. And if I could draw one thread or theme in my discussions with leaders in the Arab world, it's the potential for social unrest when 50% of the unemployment in this whole region is young people. Because what do young people do when they've got nothing to do? There's a potential for fundamentalism and leaning to that side of society. So one of the biggest issues I see for this region is, first of all, how do we get long-term unemployed young people into the workforce? Certainly the UAE is doing something about that, and pretty productively, but then if we look across the whole scene of the Arab world, it's not going so well. If you add to that the fact that there are many underemployed people in this region, and specifically I look at the female community, there are certain countries where it's not culturally acceptable to go to the workplace. There are ways of fixing that in places like Saudi Arabia, but it's not moving very, very fast. So for me, one of the issues that we brought up today as a conference was the role of education establishments in helping these groups of underemployed or unemployed people who've been socially marginalized and are proving maybe to be a problem of social unrest. How do we get them into the workforce? And I heard some quite good things today. I think we need to be much more forensic in solutions. And one thing that we came up with was that an institution like INSEAD could provide two roles. Obviously, you're not going to put in INSEAD young, unemployed people with no skills into work. It doesn't work like that. I think there is a role in this region, because we don't see too much great research going on in this area, of what is the future of the workforce. How can you get people into work in a culturally acceptable way in this region, be it long-term unemployed, be it marginalised young workers with apparently the wrong ideological views? How do you get them into a job? Because if people get into a job, then they get some pride and they start to develop, and it's a good cycle all round. So I thought it was really great today. The conference went really well. It was interesting, the interaction between the governmental views and the private sector views and the education views. But I think we all came up with a conclusion along the lines of, hey, we'd better start forecasting what we want the future to be a bit better, because if you don't know what that is, how do you design it? And everyone said today that there were at least three parties in that: the world of education, the INSEADs of the world, the business schools, the basic education establishments, the private sector and government. So I saw a good cooperation there today.
Do you think that by and large countries in this region are too dependent on importing foreign workers?
Well, of course they are, because the economies are growing so fast and have become so huge that the indigenous population cannot possibly fuel the growth of that economy. We did some forecasting with the UAE maybe a year and a half ago, before the real financial crisis hit. And our forecast said, and this is not construction workers or manual labourers from the subcontinent, that the UAE needs around about 250,000 skilled, qualified people a year to help the economy keep growing. I don't care whether the fertility rate here is 2.9 or 3.7 or whatever it is. we're never going to be able to produce enough kids in the UAE to fuel that economic growth. So therefore, there's a couple of givens here, and one of the big givens is that this region will always depend on immigrant labour to a certain extent. The question is, how do you manage and framework that immigrant labour? How do you develop bilateral treaties and relationships with other countries, specifically the subcontinent and the Philippines and other places, to get some circulatory work migration in place where qualified workers come to the countries of the Gulf and the rest of the Arab world, contribute something and pass on their skills to local people? And that's one of the questions that we considered today, and there are potentials out there. But this region, if it wants to grow economically, is stuck with the requirement for foreign immigrant labour. It's just got to be frameworked, flow processed and handled much, much better in future.
But the issue of institutionalizing that sort of knowledge transfer seems to be one of the most difficult and thorny issues of the lot, isn't it?
Well, in essence, it's not hard. But yes, institutionally, it's exceptionally difficult to make the transition of... we're a really rich country based on oil and gas or other things in the past. Therefore, we can keep our population, relatively happy, great education, great skills. Unfortunately, they don't go into the workforce. Therefore, we need foreign workers to come. We've got to break through that paradigm because the world of talent development and the utilization of talent in the Gulf states, in the Middle East, is changing. What's happening now is something very, very unusual, and we've tracked this over maybe 2 or 3 years because we're one of the biggest employers, hirers and transfer of people companies in the world and in this region. We're finding that as the talent of the population expands, as the region becomes more educated, companies who want to invest in this region from Europe, the US, China, are now saying, we'd like to have some of that top talent that comes out of the INSEAD campus, that comes out of other places, because we want our companies to learn how to get investment into the Gulf states. So this region's suffering not just from having too small a population for the size of its economy, but it's suffering from the fact that foreign organizations are coming here and taking the locally developed talent that might be Emirati, might be Egyptian, it might be Jordanian, out of the region to help them develop strategies to gain inward investment into the region. So as places like Europe and the US, the population starts to flatten and then fall. For instance, Europe loses 50 million workers over the next 17 years because of fertility rates. Europe is looking to places like Turkey and Egypt to get talent to move into Europe on a controlled basis to keep the economy expanding. The other thing that Europe is looking at is, where is the talent being produced? The Gulf states and the Arab world has poured so much money into higher level education over the last 30 years that it's a classic headhunting ground for foreign corporations. So, population isn't that big. The population that's been very well educated is being headhunted out of the region. So most governments and organizations here need to develop a strategy to try to keep the talent here based around an employment brand for each country that will be productive to help keep industry local, if you like. So it's a big challenge.
You've highlighted a number of challenges here, but it would really require a major change of mindset because in some ways, some of the things you're talking about go against the culture.
It's funny that the governments of, let's say, the Gulf operate just like most other governments that I know, just like China, just like the UK. Usually at the top there are some smart people and then there are some decent policy makers. Then there's a huge bureaucracy between policy and implementing the practice. And actually what we work on with most of the governments here is to turn those policy ideas, the good ones, and there are very smart people that know exactly what the economy needs, into practice. And we said today that one of the roles that an organisation like INSEAD could play is to provide longer term research, development, an intellectual think tank that can change not just scientific or management things for the future and get a new mentality, but can change policy practice from where it is today of great ideas, very poor bureaucracy, therefore very poor implementation, can help with the whole leadership and education process to transform that into a 21st century governmental paradigm.
And that's going to be a long-term project.
It means there's lots of money here for organisations like INSEAD, yes, but no, seriously, it is really long-term, but it's work that needs to be done now. because if the countries of the Gulf do not transform themselves within 5 years, they're going to find their talent that's been expensively educated here is going to leave. And I think that's a prerogative for any country in the future. Keep our talent.
David Arkless of Manpower, thanks for joining us.